The groom hits the bride in front of the guests, but what happens next?
Hello everyone, enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
Anthony and Elizabeth's wedding was the center of attention among the elite, with powerful and famous individuals in attendance. However, the atmosphere inside carried an unusual tension, like a taut string on the verge of snapping. Elizabeth, the bride in a pristine white dress, stood in the middle of the banquet hall, her heart weighed down. The forced smiles and scrutinizing gazes of the guests made her uncomfortable. Anthony stood beside her in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, but his expression lacked warmth. In his eyes lingered a sense of control and domination, something Elizabeth had come to recognize throughout the wedding preparations. Anna, Elizabeth's best friend, approached and whispered to her, "Elizabeth, are you okay? Did he do something to you?" "I'm fine, Anna," Elizabeth replied, but her eyes betrayed her unease. "It's just, he changes when things don't go his way." "Changes how?" Anna asked, her voice filled with suspicion. Elizabeth didn't have time to respond before Anthony turned toward them, his gaze icy. "A bride shouldn't take her eyes off the groom on her big day, my love." Anna stepped back, sensing Anthony's warning look. She knew he disliked her presence, but she couldn't abandon her best friend in this situation. The reception began with soft music and an endless flow of fine wine. Elizabeth tried to immerse herself in the atmosphere but felt increasingly detached. The people around her felt distant, their conversations filled with flattery and insincere questions. Suddenly, an elderly guest, Mr. James, brought up a topic that captured everyone's attention. "Elizabeth, wasn't there a musician you used to date? Someone named Michael, I believe." The air grew heavy. Anthony, holding a glass of wine, froze. He turned to Elizabeth, his gaze burning. "Michael who?" Anthony asked, his voice low but menacing. Elizabeth, flustered, tried to explain, "It's in the past, darling. It's all over now." "Over?" Anthony's voice hardened, cutting her off. "Then why is it still being mentioned?" The guests began whispering among themselves. Anthony could no longer maintain his composure. He set his glass down on the table with a resounding clink, breaking the stillness of the hall. "Perhaps you've forgotten that you are my wife, Elizabeth," Anthony continued, his voice rising. "And I do not tolerate betrayal, even in thought." Elizabeth stepped back, feeling cornered. She spoke, her voice trembling, "Anthony, I haven't done anything wrong. Please, let me explain." "Explain?" Anthony laughed coldly. "Do you think I'm foolish enough to believe your excuses?" Anna, standing nearby, stepped forward, trying to intervene. "Anthony, this isn't the right place for an argument. Let Elizabeth calm down." "You have no right to interfere in our affairs, Anna," Anthony retorted, his gaze filled with disdain. "You should learn to keep quiet." Elizabeth looked at Anna, her eyes pleading. But before Anna could say more, Anthony suddenly raised his hand and slapped Elizabeth hard. The sound echoed through the hushed hall. Elizabeth staggered, clutching her cheek as tears streamed down her face. The crowded banquet hall fell into a deathly silence. Stunned and horrified gazes turned toward the couple. Some guests began leaving, unable to tolerate the violent display. Others stood frozen, shocked by what had just transpired. Anthony remained where he was, his face cold and showing no remorse. "This is how you need to learn your place, Elizabeth," he said, his voice indifferent. Elizabeth couldn't say anything. She just stood there, tears flowing uncontrollably. Anna stepped forward, trying to pull her away from the crowd, but Elizabeth seemed too weak to move. Anthony's mother, Mary, approached not to protect Elizabeth but to deliver her judgment. "A woman must know her duties," Mary said coldly, her voice like a final verdict. Those words were the last straw, leaving Elizabeth feeling completely isolated. No one was on her side, except for Anna. But even Anna's comfort couldn't ease the humiliation and pain Elizabeth was enduring. As the party continued under a suffocating atmosphere, Elizabeth could only silently endure, drowning in pain and helplessness. Elizabeth sat slumped on a long sofa in a secluded corner of the banquet hall, her eyes red and swollen, her face still marked by Anthony's slap. The sparkling light from the crystal chandeliers seemed to mock her fragility, making her feel small and lost amidst the cold, extravagant surroundings. The fragmented laughter and chatter of the remaining guests echoed faintly, as if from a distant world far removed from hers. Anna knelt beside Elizabeth, gently holding her hand. "Elizabeth, listen to me. You can't let this continue. You have to leave here immediately," Anna whispered, her eyes filled with concern. Elizabeth shook her head, her voice trembling. "You don't understand, Anna. I can't. I have nowhere to go. My family has invested everything in this marriage. If I leave, I'll disappoint them." Anna gripped Elizabeth's hand tighter, trying to bring her back to reality. "Your family wants you to be happy, not abused. Anthony doesn't love you. You need to think about yourself." Before Elizabeth could respond, Anthony approached. His cold, sharp eyes and stern expression immediately made Elizabeth shrink back. "What do you think you're doing?" Anthony asked, his voice low but full of menace. "Are you planning to cry in front of the guests to humiliate me?" Anna stood up abruptly, positioning herself between Anthony and Elizabeth. "She hasn't done anything wrong, Anthony. You're the one who should be ashamed of your actions." Anthony smirked disdainfully, looking Anna up and down. "This is a matter between my wife and me. You should stay out of it. This is your final warning." Elizabeth quickly grabbed Anna's hand, pulling her back to avoid escalating the situation further. She looked at Anthony with pleading eyes. "Please, Anthony, don't make a scene. I'm sorry if I upset you. Let's put this behind us." "Sorry?" Anthony laughed coldly. "Do you think your apology can fix what you've done? Don't forget, you're my wife, and you must learn to obey." From a distance, Mary, Anthony's mother, approached, her authoritative presence amplifying the tension in the air. "What's all this commotion about, Anthony?" Mary asked, her eyes briefly sweeping over Elizabeth with icy detachment. Anthony turned to his mother, his expression still stony. "Nothing, just teaching Elizabeth how to behave properly." Mary nodded and then looked directly at Elizabeth. "Elizabeth, you should understand that in this family, honor comes first. Emotional outbursts are unacceptable. As a wife, you must uphold the family image and comply with your husband's wishes." Mary's words felt like another blow to Elizabeth's spirit. She bowed her head, feeling like a prisoner shackled by invisible chains of control and oppression. Anna couldn't hold back her anger. "This is absurd. Are you justifying your son's violent behavior? A woman like Elizabeth doesn't deserve to be treated this way, Mrs. Mary." Mary turned to Anna, her eyes filled with contempt. "You should know your place, Anna. This is not your business." Elizabeth tugged on Anna's arm again, her voice a desperate whisper. "Enough, Anna. Please don't say more. You'll only make things worse." Anna looked at Elizabeth, her eyes full of anguish, but she remained silent, unwilling to add to her friend's burden. Anthony turned and walked away coldly, leaving Elizabeth and Anna standing there in the heavy silence. The party continued, but the atmosphere had completely shifted. The murmurs of gossip spread throughout the room. Elizabeth could feel the pity, curiosity, and judgmental gazes directed at her. A young waiter named Michael, with a look of compassion, discreetly handed Elizabeth a tissue. He spoke softly, just enough for her to hear. "Do you need any help, ma'am?" Elizabeth looked at Michael but didn't respond. His kind gesture only deepened her humiliation, making her feel even weaker. Anna pulled Elizabeth aside to a quiet corner where no one could hear them. "Elizabeth, listen to me. You can't let them keep doing this to you. They'll destroy you, piece by piece." "I know, but I'm not strong enough, Anna. I don't know what to do, Elizabeth admitted, her voice filled with despair. Anna gripped Elizabeth's shoulders firmly, her voice resolute. You don't have to be strong alone. I'm here with you. But you need to decide to leave. This isn't the life you deserve. Elizabeth looked at Anna, tears welling in her eyes. Anna's words felt like a faint ray of light in her dark, suffocating world, but the psychological chains and familial pressures still held her captive, making it impossible for her to decide. Mary approached again, this time with a facade of gentle authority. Elizabeth, fix your appearance and return to the party. Don't let these trivial matters ruin the family's reputation. Show that you're worthy of your position. Elizabeth stood there, her hands clenched tightly together. She didn't know whether to continue enduring or to find a way out of this hell. Elizabeth slowly walked across the grand hall, where the crystal chandeliers continued to shine, indifferent to her suffering. Her unsteady steps drew glances from a few guests, but no one spoke. Everyone remained silent, as if the silence itself was part of the power play orchestrated by Anthony and his family. In a distant corner of the hall, Mrs. Mary stood with her close friends, Mrs. Elisa and Mrs. Carmen, older women from the upper class. They chuckled and exchanged knowing glances as they looked toward Elizabeth. That Elizabeth girl is so weak, Mrs. Elisa remarked softly, but loud enough for Elizabeth to hear. I can't believe Anthony chose someone like her to marry. But she's beautiful, Mrs. Carmen replied with a smirk. Maybe that's the only reason. Mrs. Mary, standing at the center, smiled with smug satisfaction. It's fine. My son will teach her how to be a proper wife. Women like Elizabeth need guidance, otherwise, they won't know how to behave. Those words felt like daggers stabbing Elizabeth's soul. She stood there silently, her eyes filled with tears but no longer shedding them. The tears she had already cried seemed to have drained her of all strength. Anna, noticing Elizabeth frozen in place, quickly walked over and pulled her into a more secluded corner. Elizabeth, you can't just stand here and let them hurt you like this, Anna said, her voice filled with indignation. They have no right to treat you this way. Elizabeth lowered her head, her voice a weak whisper. I don't know what to do, Anna. I feel trapped, like there's no way out. Meanwhile, Anthony appeared on the other side of the room. He was speaking with a group of businessmen, but his eyes kept darting toward Elizabeth. A cold smile flickered across his face as he saw her bow her head, looking like a caged bird. Slowly, Anthony began to make his way toward Elizabeth and Anna, like a predator closing in on his prey. Anna, Anthony called her name, his voice icy. You should leave. This is a family event, not a place for friends to meddle in private matters. Anna straightened up, her gaze fearless. Private matters? Do you really think your actions are private, Anthony? You slapped Elizabeth in front of everyone. Anthony shrugged, his face devoid of remorse. Elizabeth needed to learn how to behave. It's a lesson she should have understood long ago. And you, Anna said, her voice filled with anger, have you ever questioned what right you have to hurt her like this? She's your wife, not your property. Anthony ignored Anna and turned to Elizabeth instead. He leaned down, his voice soft but laced with control. My love, you should go to your room, change your clothes, and return to the party. Everyone is waiting for us. Elizabeth looked at Anthony, her gaze empty, devoid of resistance. She felt everything around her fading into a blur, her body drained of all strength. Anna grabbed Elizabeth's hand, trying to pull her away, but Elizabeth gently shook her head. I can't, Anna, Elizabeth said softly, tears brimming in her eyes again. If I leave, I'll bring shame to my family. Shame. Anna burst out, unable to contain her frustration. Do you really think enduring this abuse is less shameful? Or letting Anthony and his mother continue to control you? Their argument attracted the attention of a few nearby guests, but no one dared to approach. Seeing the curious stares beginning to focus on him, Anthony shifted his demeanor. He placed a hand on Elizabeth's shoulder, feigning comfort. "All right, my love," Anthony said, his voice sweet but insincere. "Let's not cause any more commotion. Just do as I say, okay?" Elizabeth nodded weakly, like a puppet manipulated by Anthony. Anna, seething with anger, could only watch helplessly as Elizabeth complied. Across the hall, Michael, the young waiter, watched the scene from a distance. Holding a tray of wine glasses, his eyes were filled with sympathy. He knew he couldn't intervene, but his gaze followed Elizabeth, as if trying to offer her a sliver of hope. Elizabeth allowed Anthony to lead her back to the center of the banquet hall, where the guests resumed their artificial conversations and forced smiles. Anthony placed a glass of wine in Elizabeth's hand, as though compelling her to partake in the charade. "Smile, Elizabeth," Anthony whispered, his tone laced with warning. "Unless you want to embarrass me again." Elizabeth forced herself to smile, but it was twisted and filled with pain. She felt as though she was sinking deeper into a bottomless abyss, where all resistance seemed futile. The eyes around her continued to watch, but no one dared to speak up, no one dared to step forward. Alone and desperate, Elizabeth realized that in this world, she had no support except herself. The party carried on, but the tension between Elizabeth and Anthony was like an undercurrent, making everything stifling. Anthony kept smiling, engaging in conversation with powerful guests, while Elizabeth stood silently beside him, like a decorative figure. Her eyes were still swollen and red, and although she tried to mask her emotions, her face could not hide the pain and humiliation. Anna, standing in a distant corner, kept glancing at Elizabeth, her worry growing. She couldn't accept her best friend being pushed into this situation but felt powerless against the dominance of Anthony and his family. Michael, the young waiter, cautiously approached Anna. "Miss, I know I shouldn't interfere, but, is she okay?" Michael asked softly, his eyes full of concern. Anna glanced at Michael, then replied, her voice choked. "No, she's not okay. But I don't know what to do to help her right now." Michael hesitated for a moment before whispering. "If needed, I can help her leave. I know a less crowded way out." Anna looked at Michael, her eyes widening in surprise at the young man's bravery. But she could only shake her head. "Thank you, but she's not ready. Elizabeth is trapped by fear and pressure." Michael nodded, his expression turning somber. He understood that sometimes, a person has to decide for themselves to step out of their own hell. On the other side of the hall, Mrs. Mary stood among a group of guests, her eyes still observing Elizabeth. It seemed Mary cared little about her daughter-in-law's feelings, focusing only on maintaining the family's image. She slowly walked toward Elizabeth, her high heels clicking authoritatively against the marble floor. "Elizabeth, come with me," Mary said, her tone leaving no room for refusal. Elizabeth looked to Anthony for help, but he only nodded, signaling her to comply. Elizabeth had no choice but to follow Mary out into the hallway, where the brilliant light of the chandeliers did little to warm the coldness in Mary's voice. "Elizabeth, you must understand that your position is a privilege," Mary said, her tone full of authority. "Anthony chose you, and you should be grateful for that. But if you don't behave properly, you won't last in this family." Elizabeth lowered her head, unable to respond. She didn't know what to say, torn between her suffering and fear. "I will not allow anyone to tarnish this family's reputation," Mary continued, her eyes piercing. "If you want to live peacefully, you need to learn to comply. Do you understand?" Elizabeth looked up at Mary, her eyes red with suppressed anger. But she still couldn't fight back. She only nodded weakly, a reluctant agreement. Returning to the hall, Elizabeth saw Anthony standing with a group of guests, including Mr. James and Mrs. Elisa. All eyes turned to her as she entered. Elizabeth felt like a puppet, controlled and voiceless, deprived of freedom. Anna approached again, this time without the caution she had shown before. "Elizabeth, that's enough," Anna said firmly. "You can't keep doing this. Let me take you out of here." No, Anna, Elizabeth whispered, struggling to maintain her composure. I can't. If I leave, everything will fall apart. Fall apart? Anna shouted, ignoring the curious stares around them. What will fall apart? You or Anthony's family? Don't you see? They only care about themselves, not you. Anthony arrived at that moment, his face colder than ever. Anna, I think you should leave immediately, Anthony said sharply. You have no right to interfere in my family's affairs. Family affairs? This isn't a family affair, Anna retorted fearlessly. This is abuse, and you have no right to hurt Elizabeth. Anthony didn't reply to Anna. Instead, he turned to Elizabeth, his gaze full of control. Come with me, Anthony ordered, not waiting for Elizabeth to respond. Elizabeth looked at Anna, her eyes brimming with tears, but in the end, she followed Anthony. She felt like she was being pulled into a vortex with no escape, where all attempts at resistance seemed futile. From a distance, Michael continued to watch Elizabeth. He couldn't do much, but in his eyes, there was a glimmer of determination. Perhaps, he thought, he would find a way to help her, no matter the cost. Elizabeth returned to the center of the party, but everything felt different. The guests were no longer laughing and chatting freely. Instead, there were furtive glances and hushed whispers full of curiosity. Elizabeth felt completely isolated, with no one by her side except Anna. But even Anna couldn't do anything to pull her out of this darkness. The atmosphere of the banquet hall had turned into a dreadful play, with Elizabeth as the central character. The eyes around her never stopped scrutinizing her, filled with pity and curiosity, but no one spoke up. They were all afraid of Anthony's power and Mary's influence. Elizabeth felt as if the whole world had turned its back on her. Anthony remained by her side, gripping her hand tightly, a warning that she was not to leave her place. His voice, soft yet sharp, reached her ears. Smile, Elizabeth. You wouldn't want to embarrass me in front of our guests, would you? Elizabeth tried to smile, but it was a crooked, painful expression. She couldn't hide the tremble in her eyes. From a distance, Anna continued to watch, her fists clenched tightly. She knew her friend was trapped in fear, but how could she save Elizabeth when she herself had no power here? Mary approached once more, her cold and calculating gaze fixed on Elizabeth. She looked her up and down before turning to Anthony, her tone laced with derision. She still needs a lot of molding, Anthony. She hasn't fully understood her role yet. Anthony nodded in agreement with his mother's remark. He turned to Elizabeth, his voice gentle but brimming with pressure. You should listen to my mother. She's always right. Elizabeth could only bow her head. Inside her, a scream was building, but she couldn't let it out. She feared that any resistance would lead to even worse consequences. At that moment, Anna couldn't stay still any longer. She quickly stepped forward, placing herself between Elizabeth and Anthony. That's enough, Anthony, Anna said firmly. Can't you see that Elizabeth has endured enough? Anthony smirked, his gaze dripping with disdain. You have no right to speak to me like that, Anna. This is a family matter. It doesn't concern you. Doesn't concern me? Anna retorted, her eyes blazing with anger. She's my best friend. And I won't let you continue to destroy her. Anthony stepped closer to Anna, his voice low and threatening. You should leave before I lose my patience. Elizabeth quickly grabbed Anna's hand, her voice pleading. Don't, Anna. Please, don't make things worse. I'm begging you. Anna looked at Elizabeth, her eyes filled with sorrow. She wanted to fight back, but Elizabeth's plea left her with no choice but to remain silent. In another corner of the hall, Michael stood watching everything unfold. His eyes were full of sympathy and sorrow. He wanted to intervene, but as a waiter, any action he took would be meaningless. Yet, he resolved not to let Elizabeth endure this alone. The music in the hall continued to play, but to Elizabeth, it had become meaningless noise. She felt utterly alone, with no one to lean on, no one on her side except Anna. But even Anna couldn't help her escape the grip of Anthony and his family. An older guest, Mr. James, quietly approached Anthony. A respected figure in the business world and a longtime friend of the family, James placed a hand on Anthony's shoulder, his voice steady but firm. "Anthony, perhaps you should let Elizabeth rest. She doesn't look well." Anthony turned to James, his expression cold. "Thank you for your advice, but this is a private matter." James frowned but said nothing more. He knew Anthony was the kind of man who wouldn't easily change his perspective, and any advice would be futile. Elizabeth looked at James with gratitude in her eyes, but she knew that this small act of support wasn't enough to save her from her current predicament. She felt like a small boat trapped in a stormy sea, with no direction and no guiding light. Mary resumed control of the situation. She signaled to a waiter to clean up and rearrange the party, ensuring no unnecessary attention was drawn to the events. She wanted everything to appear normal, at least to the guests. "Elizabeth, come with me," Mary said, her tone leaving no room for refusal. Elizabeth had no choice but to follow, even though every fiber of her being longed to flee. Mary led her out to the balcony, where the cold moonlight illuminated the scene. "You must understand that there is no place for weakness in this family," Mary said, her voice authoritative. "If you cannot fulfill your duties, you will not last long." Elizabeth lowered her head in silence. Mary's words felt like chains tightening around her, binding her even more tightly to this oppressive marriage. Back inside, Anthony continued chatting with the guests as though nothing had happened. The fake smiles, the flattery, all of it was a facade masking the terrible truth that Elizabeth was enduring. Elizabeth returned to the banquet hall, but her eyes were empty. She felt too drained to carry on but didn't dare to stand up and resist. Everything around her now felt like an inescapable nightmare. She sat alone on a long sofa in a secluded corner of the hall. The dazzling light from the crystal chandeliers still shone brightly, but to her, it was cold and distant. The soft music and the laughter of the guests no longer reached her. Elizabeth felt her body growing weary, as though all her energy had been drained after hours of humiliation and oppression. Anna quietly approached her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "I can't stand this anymore, Elizabeth. You have to leave." "They don't deserve your endurance," Anna said. Elizabeth looked up, her eyes red and filled with tears. Her voice trembled as she replied. "Anna, I want to leave. But I don't know how. Anthony and his mother, they won't let me go." Anna sat down beside Elizabeth, gripping her hand tightly. "Elizabeth, you're not alone. I'm here. I'll protect you. We'll find a way. But if I leave, my family will face pressure. I'll disappoint them," Elizabeth said weakly. Anna squeezed her hand even tighter, her eyes filled with determination. "Your family will understand. The most important thing is that you protect yourself. You can't let them keep hurting you." At that moment, Anthony approached. His posture remained commanding, but his eyes bore into Anna with a chilling warning. "Anna, how many times do I have to tell you? This is a family matter. You have no right to interfere," Anthony said, his voice menacing. Anna stood up, showing no fear. "A family matter? You think abuse is a family matter? You think you have the right to hurt Elizabeth just because she's your wife?" Anthony smirked coldly and turned to Elizabeth. "What have you been telling her? What are you trying to do, Elizabeth? Cause trouble for me in front of our guests?" Elizabeth shook her head as tears streamed down her face. "No, Anthony, I didn't do anything. I was just sitting here." Anthony stepped closer to Elizabeth, leaning down. His voice was quiet but filled with threat. "You've embarrassed me enough. Stand up, fix your dress, and get back to the party. I don't want to hear any more excuses from you." Anna could no longer hold back and shouted. "You have no right to treat her like this, Anthony. She's not your property. Anthony turned to Anna, his eyes blazing. Do you really think you can change anything? Elizabeth is my wife. She belongs to me, and I will decide what she does. Elizabeth, terrified, desperately tried to pull Anna away, pleading with her. Anna, please. That's enough. Don't make things worse. I'm begging you. Anna looked at Elizabeth, her eyes filled with pain and disappointment. But she understood that Elizabeth was trapped in a cycle with no way out and that any resistance now would only make things worse. Anthony turned his back and pulled Elizabeth to her feet. Let's go. Get back to the party. I don't want to see you sitting here crying for another second. Elizabeth had no strength left to fight back. She let Anthony pull her away, like a lifeless doll. But deep within, she felt a small flame beginning to form a flicker of resistance, though faint and fragile. When they returned to the banquet hall, all eyes immediately turned to Elizabeth and Anthony. Some of the guests looked at Elizabeth with pity, but no one dared to speak up. Mary, standing amidst the crowd, smiled in satisfaction upon seeing that Elizabeth had obeyed and returned. Michael, the young waiter, observed from afar. He felt the injustice permeating the room, but he didn't know what to do. In his heart, a bold idea began to form: he had to help Elizabeth, no matter what it took. The party continued, but the atmosphere had changed. The laughter and chatter were now nothing more than a hollow facade. Anthony maintained the guise of the perfect husband, conversing with the guests as if nothing had happened. Elizabeth stood silently by his side, like a shadow. Anna, standing at a distance, couldn't bear it any longer. She looked toward Michael, her eyes pleading for help. Michael understood and cautiously approached her. Is there anything I can do? Michael asked quietly. Do you know a way out where no one will notice? Anna asked, her tone serious. Michael nodded and whispered. There's a back exit near the kitchen. But we'll have to be quick, or they'll notice. Anna nodded, her eyes filled with determination. She knew this might be the only chance to save Elizabeth from her current situation. The next morning, Rosewood Manor lay quiet under the gentle morning sunlight. But inside, the atmosphere was far from peaceful. Elizabeth sat in her room, her gaze distant as she stared out the large window. She hadn't been able to sleep all night, her mind swirling with chaotic thoughts. The silence of the manor only deepened her pain. The door to her room opened, and Anna entered with a small bag. She had left the party the night before but had returned that morning to check on Elizabeth. The moment Elizabeth saw Anna, she broke down in tears, clinging to her friend as if Anna was the only anchor she had. Anna. I can't endure this any longer, Elizabeth whispered, tears streaming down her face. I don't know what to do. Anna gently stroked Elizabeth's hair, her voice steady and resolute. Elizabeth, you don't have to endure this. It's time for you to stand up for yourself. You deserve respect, not to be treated like a possession. But if I do, Anthony will retaliate. And his mother, she won't let me go, Elizabeth replied, her voice trembling. Anna looked at Elizabeth, her eyes unwavering. Do you think you can live like this forever? Every time you endure humiliation, you lose a part of yourself. You need to take your life back, Elizabeth. And you don't have to do it alone. I'll be here for you. Elizabeth remained silent, but Anna's words were like a faint ray of light in the darkness. She knew Anna was right, yet her heart was still filled with fear. A moment later, the door opened again. This time, it was Michael, the young waiter from the party. He stepped inside, his expression a mix of concern and determination. I'm sorry for coming here uninvited, but I can't stand by and watch this happen, Michael said, his voice warm yet firm. I want to help you, Elizabeth. Elizabeth looked at Michael in surprise. She hadn't expected someone like him to care about her situation. Michael, you don't have to do this, Elizabeth said, trying to hide her emotions. You don't owe me anything. No, but I can't stay silent, Michael replied. You don't deserve to live like this. I know some people who can help you leave safely. Anna looked at Michael, her eyes lighting up with hope. She turned to Elizabeth, her voice urging. Listen, Elizabeth. This is your chance to leave. He's right. We can't let Anthony and Mary control your life any longer. Elizabeth looked at Anna, then at Michael. In her heart, small flickers of hope began to rise. But just as she was about to speak, a cold voice echoed from the doorway. You think you can run away from here, Elizabeth? Anthony stepped into the room, his face rigid, his eyes blazing with anger. Behind him stood Mary, her expression icy and sharp. How ridiculous, Anthony said, moving toward Elizabeth. Do you think you'll go anywhere without my permission? Elizabeth trembled, but Anna stepped in front of her, her gaze fearless. Anthony, you can't force Elizabeth to live a life she doesn't want, Anna said firmly. She has the right to leave. Anthony sneered, looking at Anna with contempt. What fantasy are you living in? Elizabeth is my wife. She belongs to me. And no one, not even you, can change that. Michael stepped forward, standing face to face with Anthony. His voice was calm but resolute. Mr. Anthony, if you truly love her, you should set her free instead of keeping her in a marriage that feels like a prison, Michael said, his voice steady but firm. Anthony glared at Michael, his face contorted with anger. You're just a waiter. You have no right to interfere in my affairs. Michael didn't back down. I may just be a waiter, but I'm a human being. And I can't stand by and watch a woman be treated like this. Mary interrupted the argument, her voice cold and sharp. Anthony, don't waste your time on insignificant people. We need to resolve this matter immediately. Elizabeth looked at her husband and mother-in-law, feeling cornered. But this time, something inside her felt different. As she glanced at Anna and Michael, she realized she wasn't entirely alone. Elizabeth stood up, her voice soft but resolute. Anthony, I've had enough. I'm not staying here for another minute. Anthony froze, stunned, unable to believe his ears. What did you say? He shouted, his voice filled with rage. Elizabeth took a deep breath, her eyes full of determination. I'm leaving. And no one can stop me. Anna smiled, proud that Elizabeth was finally standing up for herself. Michael looked at Elizabeth with respect and encouragement. Anthony stepped forward, about to say something, but this time, Elizabeth didn't back down. She met his gaze head-on, her voice strong. You can do whatever you want, Anthony. But I won't let you control my life anymore. Mary tried to interject. Elizabeth, you're making a huge mistake. But Elizabeth didn't listen. For the first time in months, she felt in control of her destiny. The room seemed frozen after Elizabeth's declaration. Neither Anthony nor Mary could believe their ears. A woman they had always deemed weak and incapable of resistance was now standing up against them. Anthony took a step closer, his eyes blazing with fury, his voice low and threatening. Elizabeth, what kind of fantasy are you living in? Do you think you can leave without my permission? Elizabeth didn't flinch. She took a deep breath, her gaze unwavering. Anthony, I'm not your property. I've endured enough. You can be angry, you can make threats, but you no longer have control over my life. Mary stepped forward, her voice as cold as steel. Elizabeth, you need to think this through. You're destroying this family. Our honor cannot be tarnished by your reckless actions. Elizabeth turned to face her mother-in-law, and for the first time in her life, she dared to meet Mary's authoritative gaze directly. Honor? Elizabeth let out a bitter laugh, her eyes brimming with tears. What honor does this family have, Mrs. Mary? Allowing your son to treat me like a slave? Watching and supporting the abuse? Elizabeth's words made Mary falter for a moment, but she quickly regained her icy composure. You say that because you don't understand the meaning of sacrifice. A wife must learn to be submissive. Anna could no longer stay silent. She stepped forward, her voice sharp and cutting. Submissive? Mrs. Mary, what century are you living in? No one has the right to force a woman to endure this. Elizabeth has the right to decide her own life. Anthony raised his hand, signaling an end to the argument. He turned to Elizabeth, his voice lowering as he attempted to sound conciliatory. Elizabeth, I don't want to argue anymore. We can sit down and talk. But I can't let you leave. I can't lose you. His words sounded sincere, but Elizabeth could see the falseness behind them. She shook her head, her voice calm but resolute. You don't want to lose me, Anthony. Then why have you treated me like an object? If you truly loved me, you wouldn't make me live in fear every single day. Michael, standing in the corner, observed everything. He knew his position didn't grant him the right to interfere, but seeing the determination in Elizabeth's eyes, he couldn't stay silent. Miss Elizabeth is right, Mr. Anthony, Michael said, stepping forward. If you truly love her, you would let her go. A woman is not something you can own or control. Anthony spun around, his face contorted with fury. Shut up. This is none of your business. Michael didn't flinch. He stepped closer, his voice steady but filled with conviction. I know I'm just a waiter, but I'm also a human being. And I can't stand by and do nothing while a woman is treated this way. Michael's words moved Elizabeth deeply. She looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. Turning back to Anthony, she stood firm, no longer afraid. Anthony, I've made my decision. I'm leaving. And you can't stop me. Anna stepped beside Elizabeth, taking her hand as if to affirm that she wasn't alone. Elizabeth, let's go. Don't let them make you change your mind, Anna said. Anthony, still unwilling to give up, approached Elizabeth, his voice rising with anger. If you walk out that door, Elizabeth, don't ever come back. You'll have nothing left. Do you understand? Elizabeth lifted her head high, her eyes brimming with determination. Anthony, I don't need anything from you. All I need is my life back. Mary, though maintaining her icy composure, let her eyes betray a flicker of rage. She turned to Anthony, her voice low. Don't let her go. You'll regret it. But this time, nothing could stop Elizabeth. She walked away, holding tightly onto Anna's hand, leaving Anthony and Mary standing motionless in the room. Michael quickly guided the two women out of the mansion through the back exit he had prepared earlier. Stepping outside, the fresh morning air felt like a new breath of life for Elizabeth. She felt a weight lift off her chest, as if she had just escaped an invisible cage. Michael turned to Elizabeth, his eyes filled with respect and encouragement. Miss Elizabeth, you've done the right thing. Don't ever look back. Elizabeth looked at Michael and smiled, though tears continued to stream down her face. Thank you, Michael. You gave me the courage I didn't know I had. Anna embraced Elizabeth, her voice gentle yet full of pride. You did it, Elizabeth. This is just the first step, but I know you'll overcome everything. Together, they walked out of the estate grounds, the bright morning sunlight illuminating the path ahead. Elizabeth knew the road before her wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she felt she had reclaimed her freedom. As Elizabeth stepped out of Rosewood Manor, her steps felt light, as if she had just broken free from an invisible shackle. The morning sunlight warmed her face, mingling with the tears still streaming down her cheeks. But this time, those tears were not of fear or pain, they were tears of liberation. Anna walked beside her, holding her hand tightly, as if to lend her strength. Michael followed quietly behind, his eyes scanning their surroundings to ensure no one from the manor was following them. When they reached Anna's car, Michael hesitated for a moment before speaking. Miss Elizabeth, I'll return to the manor to continue my work. But if you ever need anything, please call me. Here's my number. Michael handed Elizabeth a small slip of paper. She took it, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "Thank you, Michael. You've done more for me than I ever could have hoped." Michael nodded, offering a faint smile before turning and walking away. He knew Elizabeth's journey would be difficult from this point forward, but he believed she would overcome it. Anna helped Elizabeth into the car and quickly drove off. No one spoke during the entire ride, but the heavy atmosphere had lifted. Elizabeth gazed out the window, watching the rows of trees pass by, and felt a renewed sense of hope. When the car stopped in front of Anna's small apartment, Elizabeth turned to her friend, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Anna, I don't know how to thank you. If it weren't for you, I couldn't have escaped that place." Anna smiled gently and said, "You don't need to thank me, Elizabeth. The important thing is that you had the courage to stand up for yourself. I was just here to support you." They stepped into the apartment together. Anna made a cup of hot tea and placed it in front of Elizabeth. "Now you need to rest. We'll figure out everything else later," Anna said, her eyes full of care. Elizabeth nodded, but her mind kept spinning with questions. What would she do next? How would she live without relying on Anthony? How would her family react when they learned she had left the marriage they had placed so much hope in? That evening, Anna sat with Elizabeth, and they discussed the next steps. Anna suggested that Elizabeth visit a women's support center, where she could get legal advice and seek assistance. Elizabeth was hesitant at first but eventually agreed. The next morning, Anna drove Elizabeth to the center. It was a small yet welcoming place, with colorful paintings adorning the walls. Elizabeth felt her heart race as she stepped inside, but the warm reception from the staff helped ease her anxiety. An older woman named Clara, the center's manager, met with Elizabeth in a private room. Clara's kind eyes and soothing voice immediately put Elizabeth at ease. "Elizabeth, I know your decision wasn't an easy one. But you've done the right thing," Clara said gently. Elizabeth lowered her head, her eyes welling up with tears. "It took me so long to realize that. But now, I don't know where to begin." Clara smiled and placed her hand on Elizabeth's. "Starting over is always a difficult journey, but it's also a meaningful one. Here, we'll help you every step of the way. First, we'll provide legal advice to protect your rights, and then we'll support you in finding work and housing if you need it." Elizabeth looked at Clara, her heart filled with gratitude. For the first time in months, she felt she was not alone. In the days that followed, Elizabeth began attending counseling sessions at the center. She met other women who had been through similar experiences. They shared their stories, and Elizabeth realized she wasn't the only one who had faced control and abuse. Clara also connected Elizabeth with a lawyer to handle the legal proceedings. The lawyer, a sharp and confident woman named Beatrice, assured Elizabeth that she had the right to file for divorce and obtain legal protection from any threats Anthony might pose. "We'll do everything to ensure you're safe and free," Beatrice said firmly. At the same time, Elizabeth enrolled in a short course on interior design, a field she had once loved but had to abandon when she married Anthony. The hours spent learning not only helped her forget painful memories but also brought her joy and hope for a brighter future. One afternoon, while Elizabeth was sitting in Anna's apartment working on a design project, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Michael. "Hi Elizabeth, I just wanted to check in on you. I hope everything is going well. Let me know if you need anything." Elizabeth smiled as she read the message. She replied, "Thank you, Michael. Things are getting better. I'm so grateful for your help." Elizabeth set the phone down and looked out the window at the pink hues of the sunset. A sense of peace and relief began to rise within her. She knew this journey was just beginning, but Elizabeth was now ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. She had rediscovered her strength and understood that, no matter how painful the past had been, she had the right to build a new future filled with hope and freedom. Elizabeth's story teaches us about the power of independence and courage. In life, no one deserves to endure control or abuse from another. By deciding to stand up against injustice, Elizabeth found her self-worth, proving that change begins with determination. The support of friends and allies like Anna and Michael reminds us of the importance of compassion and empathy in helping others overcome adversity.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.